With the start of conflict between Russia and Ukraine, the major paradigm that has intensified to date is the consolidation of the West. Now it can be said that the protracted war is between Russia and the combined West. If we ignore the internal conflicts between the members of Europe, the augmenting support for Ukraine at a time when there is an economic meltdown is a promising stand in itself. On the ideological plank, any financial and arms support is easy to commit to, and that too when Europe has a long history of a strong established economy. But when those economic interests are subsequently hit, it becomes difficult to sustain that support. And for Europe, that interest is energy, and that is why it seems that Europe's commitment to Ukraine has two sides. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Savita Mishra and this is TFI Post. The current reports by DGCIS show that India's petroleum product exports to EU countries rose 20.4% year-on-year in April to January to 11.6 million metric tons. In January of this year, the exports touched at an all-time high of 1.9 million tons. During April 2022 and January 2023, the EU imported total of 11.61 million tons of petroleum products, which is 15% of India's total petroleum product exports, that is 79 million tons. The figure becomes more important when it is compared on a year-over-year basis. From April 2021 to January 2022, the percentage of exports to the EU was only 12% of the total petroleum exports of 79.9 million metric tons. This can be roughly calculated to 9.6 million tons. In case of petroleum product exports, DGCIS classifies the data by 20 international regions. Europe is made up of 3 regions: the EU, the European Free Trade Association, and other European countries. Similarly, Asia is divided into 6 trade regions, while 5 regions constitute Africa. If petroleum product exports to the other 2 European regions listed in the DGCIS data are added to exports to the EU, supplies from India-Europe total 14.5 million metric tons for April to January, up almost 19% over the corresponding period of the previous fiscal. The major sanction on Russian oil was imposed by G7 on December 5th of the last year, when it put an oil price cap at $60 per barrel. This led to a further decline in European imports from Russia. Just 2 months later, on Feb 5th, the ban on oil product imports took effect. The war on oil is so intense that in addition to Western sanctions, Russia has also put sanctions on the West. After the oil price came into effect, Putin signed a decree that banned the crude oil exports to the countries that sanctioned Russia. The ban took effect on Feb 1st. But why is oil embargo so much discussed? Well, the fact is that almost half of the Russian revenue comes from oil exports. If the Russian oil trade continues, Russia will not fall in the war. So Europe wants the Russian oil trade to be reduced to a minimum level. But there are reasons why the West is not outright banning trade with Russia. The most important one is to protect the world from an oil shock. Banning oil imports suddenly will create a global shortage, without which the global economy will further deteriorate. Since we are talking about EU's increased imports from India, the reason for it is Indian imports of Russian oil. Even before the announcement of the oil cap, Russia offered India cheaper oil. India took it without a second thought. This led to a surge in Russia's share of New Delhi's oil import sources. As per the figures of DGCIS, India's import of Russian oil is breaking records with each passing month. In Feb 2023, India has imported 1.62 million barrels of oil from Russia. This is an all-time high import. In January too, the imports reached an all-time high of 1.26 million barrels. It has now become the biggest supplier of crude oil to India. Initially, Europe targeted India for procuring cheap oil from Russia, claiming it was financing war. But now, a different narrative is floating in the international discourse. India's purchase and refining are considered a balancing move by them. After India refused to give up on oil trade with Russia, the motive of the embargo was not fulfilled, and Russia continued to make money out of the oil. Even the boundaries of dollars were broken. India procured unprecedented amount of crude oil from Russia, and due to its low prices, the refined end product became a more suitable oil import for most of the third world countries. But soon reports came that US was also importing oil from India. And now the EU share has increased too. But this shift in the narrative is less about the need and more about selfishness. Europe was actually heavily dependent on Russian sources for energy. And when Europe banned oil imports from Russia, it had to find other sources. To shift its dependence, the EU started to procure from India, and subsequently, the quantity of oil imports increased. So it will not be wrong to say that the EU is addicted to Russian oil. Some way or the other, it wants to maintain the influx of oil so that it can make the crisis a proxy war while sitting in their homes consuming energy. But India's role is very important now, not simply because it can provide cheap oil to the world, but also because the oil trade is witnessing a rerouting. To put it simply, the priorities of oil trade have changed for the countries, and this places India at the center of supply chains. The geo-economics of the world are shifting more towards trade and trusted partners. And in that situation, the Indian way of neutrality is the only way to trade holistically across the world.